I mentioned that Buddhism made its way to Japan through China, and hence, when it arrived in Japan, there was a sort of combination of a sort of synthesis already undertaken between the Buddhism of India and especially the Taoism of China. From that, I sort of backed up in time and went to some of the founding principles set out by the Buddha Shakyamuni. Life is suffering, the origin of suffering is attachment or striving, the cessation of attachment or striving leads to the cessation of suffering, the Eightfold Path, right views, intention, speech, actions, and so on, leads to the cessation of attachment or striving. So the sort of general outline here is very similar to some of the Vedantic principles that we went through earlier, and are probably familiar to a number of you from having learned about Buddhism in either other classes or in your own background or lives or whatever. I think that's fairly straightforward. In context of what we've talked about. I then noted the importance of karma. Again, karma is pretty much the same idea as we encountered in Vedantism. There's sort of two different interpretations of it. One, that karma is a matter of reward or punishment for good or bad things you've done. That's the idea you get foregrounded in Bhagavad Gita. Another is the idea that it's not really a matter of ethics, but a matter of attachment. And what causes one to be reborn is an attachment or a striving that leads one to, contrary to one's best interest, so to speak, to want to be reborn. You see in the plays, there are various sorts of traumas that people go through in life, and it causes them to haunt the places where they lived and experienced the trauma. So they might want revenge, as in the case of Atsumori. Or they might want the love that they felt for someone to be returned when it wasn't. There are different motives, but they're all a matter of attachment. So this is it's karma in this sense that leads one to be reborn. It's also worth noting that Buddhism has various temporary heavens and hells. The temporary hells, sometimes translated as purgatory, which is perfectly reasonable, that it can intervene between one birth and another birth. I had briefly mentioned samsara on the next bullet point is the cycle of birth and death. And as in Vedantism, one's spiritual goal in Buddhism is to escape from the cycle of suffering, which is the cycle of birth and death, which is samsara. And one aspect of this is recognizing Maya or illusion, the way in which the world is illusory. But unlike Vedantism, Buddhism sees the same impermanence in what is referred to as the soul in Vedantism, the Atman in Vedantism. And as I've mentioned, both when we were talking about the Bhagavad Gita and in class in connection with this introduction to Buddhism. Replacing the doctrine of the Atman, the permanent, unchanging, absolute soul, which is the same as Brahman, which is the same as the absolute. That doctrine in Vedantism is replaced in Buddhism with the anatta doctrine. Atta is just the Pali. Pali is a later vernacular derivative from Sanskrit. Atta is just the same word as appears in Sanskrit as Atman, simplified with the M assimilated to the preceding consonant, so it's ATTA instead of ATMA, so it's the same word. An means not, so it's the non-Atman doctrine, or the no-soul doctrine. The idea that there is no such thing as a permanent self. There's only continual mutability, continual. The soul is as ephemeral, as alterable, as continually altering as anything in the material world. This is related to a slightly different conception of the Maya of the real world, which is to say that it's seen as void, as shunya, which is also the word for zero, or either void or zero, or nothing, the nothing that we think of as reality. Okay, yeah, I'll go back to some of those points in a moment. Well, probably not that. Well, yeah, I guess. I just want to note the next bullet point is monasticism. I just want to note that a prominent part of Buddhist practice is the possibility of anyone leaving the ordinary sphere of life, anyone at any age leaving the ordinary sphere of life and entering a monastery, male or female. They're nunneries also. There is no requirement of progressing through stages of life, no requirement of repaying one's debt to ancestors or to the gods or to the sages, as there is in Hinduism. And as I may have mentioned in class before, the whole idea of a worship of a deity in early Buddhism is considered irrelevant. I mean, or the whole idea of the existence of a deity is considered irrelevant, and practices of worshiping a deity, for example, are considered beside the point. A famous sermon of Buddha Shakyamuni was arguing that the question, I don't remember how the title of the sermon is usually represented, but it's the central point is, questions not tending toward edification. I believe that's the title it usually appears under. These are sort of metaphysical or philosophical issues that just don't bear on the practice of liberating oneself, becoming enlightened, achieving nirvana. And again, nirvana is the snuffing out of the individual, changing non-Atman, which is, in a sense, the opposite. It's instead of being the absolute plenitude it's in a sense the opposite of the Vedantic idea. Instead of being the absolute plenitude and fullness of identification with Brahman, it's a recognition of shunya, of the void. anyway, the whole question of whether gods or a god even exists is, according to the Buddha's teaching, a question that does not tend toward edification. So there's no point in even thinking about it. Okay, so ahimsa and militarization. Rather like universal dharma, a central virtue of Buddhism, a key virtue of Buddhism, is ahimsa. And, well, a key practice, I should say, is ahimsa, non-violence, non-harming. This, as I mentioned last class, has not prevented Buddhist societies from being highly militarized, as in Japan at the time of the Second World War, for example, or Sri Lanka in the conflict between Sinhalese Buddhists and Tamil, the Tamil minority in that country. But that's true of every society. People are very creative in coming up with ways of reconciling moral doctrines with whatever they really want to do. And so they can usually figure out a way of reinterpreting the moral doctrine so what they're doing fits it, even though to all appearances doesn't fit it. In any case, so ahimsa is a central prescribed constraint on behavior. For this reason, one of the literary conventions is that warriors will be in some way caught in the sort of purgatory condition. They will suffer because of the violence they had to engage in as warriors. And we see that again in Atsumori and in other works, to which we'll return. Atsumori, certainly. So ahimsa is a sort of description of behavior. If you're nonviolent, if you're non-harming, that's the way you act. It's the way, I mean, it's physical things, you don't hit people or whatever. But it's also verbal, you don't insult people. It's even intentional, you don't, you constrain your thoughts so that you try to anyway, so that your thoughts are nonviolent. Now, the sort of subjective correlate of this, the virtue, I called it ahimsa a virtue before, and then I changed my phrasing and said, no, actually it's a behavior. The corresponding virtue in Buddhism is compassion. Compassion, people define it in different ways, but the crucial thing is just that compassion means empathizing with and caring about other people. Actually, it means more than that, because you may remember that that one of the problems that the compilers of the Bhagavad Gita had with Buddhism was Buddhism's rejection of the caste system. So the rejection of the caste system suggests, one of the reasons for it is that one is supposed to have compassion and behave nonviolently toward everyone of every caste. But Buddhism actually extends that further to the treatment of all sentient beings, so that Another aspect of what came to be called universal dharma in Hinduism, another aspect of the ahimsa, the nonviolence that was prescribed in the Sadharana Dharma, the universal dharma or duty of Hinduism, was not only not harming humans, but being a vegetarian, for example, not harming animals. An even more encompassing version of that is when Jain monks, that's monks of Jainism, which is another sort of non-orthodox South Asian religious philosophy, roughly contemporary, arose roughly contemporary. It developed roughly at the same time as Buddhism and Vedantism. In any case, a sort of severely rigorous version of the advocacy of nonviolence in this sense is followed by Jain monks who would take precautions so that they wouldn't accidentally step on insects, for example. They'd brush their paths as they walked along to move insects out of the way so they wouldn't harm any sentient being. And indeed, in a sort of hyperbole, some later Buddhists have a sort of slogan, and I'll explain part of this in a moment, but a sort of slogan that their goal is to keep striving to spread an understanding of enlightenment, of the fourfold, the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, until even the rocks and trees are enlightened. So that's, as I say, hyperbole. It's an overstatement, but it shows the extreme emphasis on equality that is part of Buddhist teaching, at least in principle. Okay, no. What else do I want to say about that? Oh, yeah. I'm going to want to say something about compassion in a second, but why is that not on here? I could have sworn that was on here. Well, I'm not seeing it. I wonder if maybe I call up not the most recent version of this. Anyway, I mentioned Buddhist teaching a moment ago. When you come across the words Dharma, or the Pali equivalent, you can probably guess what the Pali equivalent is. Well, there are two options. You might have changed it to D-H-A-R-R-A. It's actually D-H-A-M-M-A. Those are the same word in Sanskrit and Pali. You can see the consonant assimilation, the assimilation of two sounds in a consonant cluster. So you get only one, like TM becomes TT. So similarly here, RM becomes MM. So if you come across the word Dharma or Dhamma in a Buddhist context, it can mean ethics or law, as it does in Hindu contexts, but it more commonly means Buddhist teaching broadly, the teachings of the Buddha, Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha to whom we regularly refer, or other legendary figures of that ilk. So there are times in which my guess is, well, Tyler in your book is translating something as law, and I'm guessing that in those cases it's Dhamma. And it isn't really law in those cases, it's really Buddhist teaching. Okay, so I'll pause if you have questions in a second, but let me read something from the what is the publisher? Well, Handbook of Emotions. I think it's from 2017. Well, I can, yeah, oh, it doesn't have it's just Handbook of Emotions, okay. I think it's 2017, a very, very worthwhile book if you want to read things about research and emotion. And in one of the chapters that deals with, or one of the chapters of the volume deals with gratitude and compassion. I just thought I'd read you a couple of things about what empirical study seems to have revealed about compassion. The reason I want to read this is that it might seem initially as if it's odd that Buddhists would advocate the cultivation of any particular emotion. Just in that the cultivation of that emotion, it would appear, would attach you to something, and that would not be desirable, therefore. But the research actually indicates that by turning your focus to the well-being of others, compassion takes your focus away from some sense of you as an individual, separate, enduring self. And in removing your attention in that way and altering your attention in that way, it actually cultivates the sort of detachment detachment that Buddhists advocate, because the attachment in this view is invariably a result of a sense of a focus on oneself. That's why in the Buddhist doctrine, it's so important to affirm anatta, the non-soul doctrine. So just a few quotes to give you an idea of what the research indicates. People who care about the well-being of others, that is, those motivated by compassionate goals, are more likely to satisfy their own, and they're more likely to satisfy not only others' needs, but their own as well, compared with those who are motivated by self-interest. Now, satisfy here doesn't mean set out to satisfy. It means sort of fulfill your goals incidentally. When you're thinking about helping others, you actually become more likely to achieve, according to this research, more likely to achieve the sort of satisfaction you anticipate achieving by pursuing your own goals. But again, you're more likely to achieve that by focusing on others. Compassionate goals predict a downstream psychological well-being as indicated by self-reported feelings of trust, closeness, reduced loneliness, and reduced interpersonal conflict. Related to this, the larger social level, and this is related to ahimsa, as well as compassion, quote, cooperative groups accumulate the largest amounts of resources over time compared with groups that engage in punitive action. I find that an intriguing and hopeful finding. continuing to quote, groups that refrain from punitive action reap greater communal gains compared with groups characterized by punitive behavior. That would, of course, relate to the ahimsa again. Compassion may therefore be an effective mechanism for reducing escalations of violence, hence the relation between compassion and ahimsa. Compassion would motivate an individual to engage in action to correct the actions of a transgressor with the ultimate aim to reduce collective suffering, albeit in a non-violent manner that minimizes the transgressor's suffering. So, again, I think you can see the relations to this, to the Buddhist idea. Crocker and colleagues examined the effect of compassionate goals in college freshmen on experiences of anxiety, dysphoria, and distress throughout their first semester. Compassionate goals predicted social support given and received, but interestingly, social support given to others uniquely predicted participants' own changes in distress from beginning to the end of the semester. Thus, caring for the well-being of others over time appears to benefit an individual's own psychological well-being. Compassion, the studies indicate, compassion could, quote, compassion could play a fundamental role in promoting psychological and physical well-being in response to stress. Brown and colleagues have demonstrated across differing samples that giving support and providing care for others can contribute to one's own health and psychological well-being. Just a few more quotes here. Among participants who recently lost a spouse, self-reported compassion-related helping behavior was associated with decreased depressive symptoms. Volunteering rates among people who adopt positive views of others predict lower rates of mortality and psychological distress even when exposed to high levels of stress. Caregiving can increase self-reported feelings of self-worth, meaning in life, a strengthening in one's relationships, feelings of uplift or elevation, and a reduction in anxiety or depression. Neuroimaging evidence suggests that charitable and cooperative behavior is experienced as rewarding. And then in the last section of this paper, this chapter, the authors go on to, quote, identify factors that increase compassion, since their hope is that increasing compassion would have these positive benefits. And not surprisingly, given what I've been saying, one of the factors that, in fact, they name only two factors that are known to increase compassion. One of them is, quote, Buddhist-inspired meditation programs. So it fits directly with these points. So I'm going to stop there for a second, and then I'll go on to Mahayana Buddhism, and then we'll finally get to a play. So is there anything you want to ask or add or? Okay. All right, so as initially formulated, the Buddha Shakyamuni's teachings apply most obviously to individuals, even if they're done in a monastic or in a monastic setting. You engage in meditation alone, and you may be with other people in the same area, but your meditation is isolated, and it isn't particularly, the spiritual exercises themselves are not particularly communal, nor are the goals. When you achieve realization, you achieve it for yourself. um, that came to be known as the Hinayana, Hinayana. The Hinayana school. And it was, this was opposed to the later developing Mahayana school, which is the heading for one of the bullet points there, which just means the bigger vehicle school. And just as the smaller vehicle school, the little vehicle school focuses on people as individuals, the Mahayana, the big vehicle school, focuses on, well, people more broadly, indeed sentient beings more broadly. And the Mahayana, it's a sort of generalization of compassion. If compassion is the key virtue in Buddhist teaching, in Buddhist Dhamma, then it makes sense, it seems to make sense to expand that concern with or that advocacy of compassion to the point where it encompasses the enlightenment of all beings, not merely some sort of local nonviolence. This is the sort of intellectual background of the idea of the bodhisattva. A bodhisattva is someone who has achieved enlightenment, but has chosen not to complete that enlightenment, but to return again in subsequent lives until all sentient beings have been enlightened. So a bodhisattva is someone who defers his or her full release from samsara and from the suffering of birth and death, defers that until everyone, all souls, have been enlightened and released from the sufferings of birth and death. This is often particularly manifest or symbolized in the Bodhisattva Guanyin, who is also referred to as the goddess of mercy, and is an object of particular reverence in China. The reason I say androgynous there is that, interestingly, Guanyin was a Buddhist figure, historically related to a Buddhist figure, or derived from a Buddhist figure from India, but in India she was male, and in the course of history she began being spoken of as a woman. So I don't remember any references to Guanyin in anything we're reading in the no plays, though there might be. Oh, sorry. I was looking for Dhamma and Dharma. I thought I had it written here. It's down here. Anyway, I don't recall any references to Guanyin in what we're reading, but you're likely to come upon Guanyin if you read further in Chinese or Japanese Buddhism. It certainly would have been the case that if we'd read anything extensive in Chinese Buddhism, we would have come across her. Part of the reason for her androgyny is the result of the synthesis of Indian Buddhism with Taoism in China, and that synthesis, part of that synthesis involved combining the earlier figure of Guanyin with the Queen Mother in Taoism, but I just mentioned that because we've done some Taoism. I thought you might find it interesting. Oh yeah, even though Mahayana developed as a doctrine, the Mahayana Hinayana distinction developed as a doctrine before Buddhism was transmitted to China. it was particularly readily accepted in China, in part because of parallels with Taoism that was already there. Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to say anything more about Taoism. It just now I've been stressing the anatta doctrine, but that remains a sort of doctrinal, a central doctrinal point of Buddhism in later centuries. It isn't confined to the earlier period, but there's a very different feel, so to speak, about the later writings in Buddhism than the earlier writings. In the later writings, one has much less the sense that the momentariness of the non-soul is a point that people are actually living, so to speak. For example, and similarly with certain practices of self-realization as developed in early Buddhism. So, for example, a key point is to be found in the development of what's called Pure Land Buddhism, which is pervasive in the plays we're reading. Pure Land Buddhism refers to a pure land to which one's soul can be admitted after death if one has received the grace of a bodhisattva who will reward one or give one allow one admission to the Pure Land. And in that Pure Land, it's a pure land because the souls of those resident in the Pure Land are able to develop themselves spiritually with their full attention and without the flaws and usual attachments of material life. So as a human, you would, in this world, and as a follower of Pure Land Buddhism, you would aspire, first of all, to achieve the Pure Land, and after achieving the Pure Land, then aspire to Buddhahood or maybe to Bodhisattvahood. Hence, you see that in the ending to Atsumori, almost the ending, where the two of them are to be born, where Rensei and Atsumori are to be born on one lotus flower. Very lovely image. That means they're to be born together in the Pure Land, where they can devote themselves to becoming Buddhas, or rather Bodhisattvas, because they take a vow. As you may recall from the play, they take a vow, not a vow, a vow that anyone who calls their name will ultimately be enlightened. That takes me to the last points here. You notice that I said a bodhisattva has admitted them to, someone has achieved the grace, received the grace of a bodhisattva, and thus has been admitted to the Pure Land. The earliest Buddhist teachings were very self-sufficient, self-reliant. It's what you did in meditation, etc., that led to your illumination. And it's similarly in Vedantism and other schools of the period developed at that time. But with Pure Land and related forms of Mahayana Buddhism, one spiritual advancement is to a great extent contingent on the grace that one achieves that one receives through the agency of bodhisattvas. And you achieve this grace in part by petitionary prayer, in part simply by chanting the name of the compassionate Buddha, Amida Buddha, who becomes the sort of inspirational figure, not exactly a divine figure, but a kind of parallel to a divine figure in Pure Land Buddhism. And again, this is very prominent in the no plays. Pure Land Buddhism is. Okay, the last point I want to make will be about Zen. Before going on to that, something I meant to mention about Dharma Dhamma. I said it's better, maybe better translated as Buddhist or Buddha's teaching rather than law, as Tyler sometimes translated. But personally, I think you could also reasonably translate it as Tao, in roughly, not exactly the Taoist sense, of course, because Taoists and Buddhists don't believe exactly the same thing, but in roughly in a way that the Taoists wouldn't find like bizarre. It would be sort of familiar to Taoists. So the last point here, and then I'll pause if you have anything you want to ask. The last point on the PowerPoint is the development of what in China is called Zen meditation, and that word is comes to be pronounced as Zen meditation in Japan. This is a form of meditatively focused Buddhism, which again draws, like Pure Land and other aspects of Mahayana, draws on elements of Taoist practice that Buddhists encountered on entering China. Two other things that are worth mentioning about it. One is that it relied heavily on non-scriptural transmission, which means transmission from teachers to students, which is not necessarily written, but preserved in a lineage of oral teaching. Another thing that non-scriptural transmission was highly idiosyncratic sometimes, and it was doctrinally, it was thought that it was necessarily idiosyncratic because the point of the teaching was not to convey the objective truth. The point of the teaching was to produce a change in the meditator, in the aspirant, in the monk or nun, for example. So if you were a Zen master and you had a pupil following you and whom you were charged with aiding, your concern wouldn't be to communicate a doctrine to him. Your concern would be to shock him or her out of his or her ordinary way of thinking and to precipitate a change in thinking that would produce enlightenment. This is related to or this becomes doctrinally disputed. I mean, remember, not everybody who's a Buddhist is a Zen Buddhist. Even in Japan, there are plenty of other schools that aren't Zen. And one difference between them is whether they believe in gradual or sudden enlightenment. Zen tends to emphasize sudden enlightenment. In other words, as a monk or a nun or as a disciple of a master, you're sort of going around in the same ordinary way of thinking, a kind of fog, a kind of misguided meandering, and you don't seem to be getting anywhere, and you go to the master, and the master says, like, something completely incomprehensible, like the often quoted, the incomprehensible things he says are referred to as koans. You may remember, I'm sure you've heard one of the often quoted koans, what is the sound of one hand clapping? And you go to your master and you say, I'm suffering, I want to escape samsara, what do I do? And he says stuff like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? You're like, what? So you're moving along at the same level, and then the preceptor does something, and you suddenly get it, and everything has changed. It's sort of like the famous Gestalt shift, where it's you have a picture. It's either a duck or a rabbit, and you're going, but I can only see a duck. Where's the rabbit? Now I see the rabbit. The thing, the duck, anyway. So that's sudden enlightenment. Most schools of Buddhism advocated gradual enlightenment, which is that you, as would Vedantism generally, you'd, over the course of a number of years, you'd practice meditation. At first your thoughts would be very scattered, then you'd be able to concentrate on them more fully. Then you'd be able to extend that concentration from 30 seconds to a minute to 5 minutes, whatever. You'd be able to expand your sense of stillness, your sense of non-attachment, until you gradually encompassed your whole life and you didn't retreat from that stage. That gradual enlightenment is, for example, presupposed in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, along with the Bhagavad Gita, probably the other main text of Hindu yoga. That isn't like what happens in Zen. And again, Zen is often the form of Buddhism, and sudden enlightenment is often the form of Buddhist belief that underlies the plays. And again, you'll see that. We'll go through Atsumori in some detail, and you'll see that in Atsumori. And of course, this, for obvious reasons, the Zen sudden enlightenment idea stresses intuition, because you don't work up to it by accumulating knowledge and sharpening skills and so on. It's the sudden shift. So, excuse me. So, questions or comments or anything that? Yeah. Probably, but I wish I could answer that. I would say that Zen is particularly common in sudden enlightenment in no plays, but I just don't have any good sense of like what ordinary people think. So I wouldn't want to say that just because it serves dramatic purposes in the plays, that therefore the majority of people must have thought that way. I actually suspect that most people don't think a whole lot about the issue because they're not in, this is just conjecture, but I'm guessing it's like people anywhere. They mostly are living their lives and they sort of abstractly believe these things, but they're not entering a monastery or anything. So that'd really be among monks, how many of them in that? It's a good question. I don't know. Now I want to turn to Atsumori.